Imagine being born into privilege, castles, luxury, power, only to wake up in 1945 as the child of a monster. Your father is hanged at Nuremberg or swallows cyanide before the verdict. The world sees you not as innocent, but as the heir of atrocity. Would you defend his honor or spend your life shouting that he was a murderer? Tonight, you'll meet the children of the Reich and the shocking ways their bloodlines destroyed them. They were not soldiers, they were not leaders. They were children, yet cursed by the blood that ran in their veins. Imagine growing up not as an innocent boy or girl, but as the son or daughter of Himmler, of Göring, of Mengele, the architects of genocide, the masterminds of terror. What kind of childhood begins in gilded halls built on ashes, only to collapse into shadows of infamy when the Reich turned to ruin? As Germany burned and the swastika was torn down, the children of the Nazi elite faced a new kind of trial. They carried names that the world would never forgive. They inherited not wealth or honor, but whispers, suspicions, in the unbearable question, can one ever escape a legacy of blood? Some clung to their father's memory with a loyalty as chilling as the crimes themselves. Others tried to bury the past under new names, new lives, desperate to disappear. A few stood up against their lineage, turning their very existence into an accusation against the monsters who gave them life. This is not a tale of generals or dictators. It is the haunting story of their children, caught in a net woven by history's darkest hour. They lived in the ruins of a fallen empire, under the gaze of a world that saw in them not innocence, but shadows. Tonight we step into their fractured lives, because the war did not end in 1945. It lived on, in their blood, in their silence, in their every breath. When the Third Reich collapsed in 1945, its leaders either lay dead in bunkers, dangled from ropes, or awaited their verdicts before the world at Nuremberg. But behind the spectacle of justice, another story began in silence. The war had left Germany in ruins, cities gutted by firebombs, millions displaced, a nation branded with the mark of unspeakable crimes. Amidst this devastation, the children of Nazi leaders carried a burden unlike any other. They were not only survivors of a defeated nation, but the living reminders of its darkest architects. Picture a little girl in Munich, her father Heinrich Himmler, the man who designed the Holocaust, dead by cyanide. She bears his eyes, his name, and the impossible task of walking through life as his daughter. Or the teenage boy whose father was Hans Frank, the so-called butcher of Poland. To classmates and strangers alike, his surname was not just a word but a sentence. The sins of their fathers had become their inheritance. Post-war Germany was a place of suspicion and reckoning. Allied forces interrogated wives and children, confiscated possessions, and tore down the symbols of the Reich. Families once celebrated in the propaganda reels of Joseph Goebbels now found themselves spat upon in the streets. Children were shuffled through internment camps, interrogated about their fathers, and released into a society that neither trusted nor forgave them. Some were hidden by relatives, others fled across borders, but all bore scars invisible to the eye. The world demanded accountability, yet the question lingered. How do you punish children for the crimes of their fathers? Some of these sons and daughters tried to melt into anonymity, changing names, erasing ties. Others clung desperately to their lineage, insisting their fathers were patriots, not monsters. For them, loyalty was a twisted form of survival. This is the soil from which their lives would grow, shattered, poisoned, yet still reaching for meaning. In the rubble of Berlin, in the shadow of Nuremberg, the children of the Reich began their uneasy march into a future forever chained to the past. In the shadows of defeat, the children of the Reich began to carve paths as fractured and contrasting as their fathers' legacies. Each life became a case study in how one navigates a world that looks at you and sees not who you are, but who your father was. Gudrun Himmler, born in 1929, was the beloved daughter of Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust. To her, he was not the orchestrator of genocide, but the doting father who called her by her childhood nickname, Puppy. Even after his suicide in 1945, she clung fiercely to his memory. While others recoiled from their lineage, Gudrun embraced it. She joined clandestine networks such as Stille Hilfe, Silent Help, that aided former SS officers on the run. Her loyalty never wavered, and until her death in 2018, she defended her father's name, denying the horror he had built brick by brick. To the world, she was a chilling reminder that the embers of ideology could smolder across generations. Then there was Martin Bormann Jr., son of Hitler's private secretary and head of the Nazi Party chancellery. Born into privilege in 1930, Martin's world collapsed alongside the Reich. Unlike Gudrun, he rejected his father's ideology. He entered the priesthood, hoping to bury his father's sins under the weight of faith. He worked as a missionary in Africa, trying to atone for crimes he never committed. Yet the shadow followed him. Allegations of abuse later surfaced, staining the redemption he sought. His life became a tragic circle, a man trying to escape his father's darkness, only to stumble into new shadows of his own making. Niklas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, the butcher of Poland, chose the most radical path of all. Born in 1939, too young to fully grasp the war's horror, Niklas grew into a man who wielded words like weapons. He wrote books, delivered lectures, and made it his mission to denounce his father at every turn. Where Gudrun Himmler defended and Martin Bormann sought redemption, Niklas became an accuser. He declared his father a monster, unworthy of forgiveness, and urged Germany never to forget. For Niklas, survival meant confrontation, a public reckoning with the blood in his veins. Others tried to live silently in the ruins of their names. Etta Goering, daughter of Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, once lived a childhood of opulence, paraded before cameras as proof of a happy Nazi family. After her father swallowed poison at Nuremberg, she retreated into obscurity. Yet behind closed doors, she whispered a different story. Her father was kind, misunderstood, a man she loved. The contradiction defined her life. In public, silence. In private, devotion. Rolf Mengele, son of the infamous Angel of Death, Josef Mengele, bore perhaps the heaviest cross. A lawyer by trade, he lived in the Federal Republic of Germany under the weight of letters from a father who had fled to South America. When he finally met Mengele in 1977, he encountered not remorse, but pride. Josef Mengele boasted of his experiments as if they were triumphs. Rolf left in disgust, severing ties. Yet he kept his father's secret, allowing the fugitive doctor to die a free man. His silence made him complicit in the eyes of history, a prisoner of a blood bond he could neither embrace nor betray. Wolf Hess, son of Rudolf Hess, Hitler's deputy, spent his life in defense of a man condemned as a war criminal. He argued his father's flight to Scotland in 1941 was a peace mission, not treason. He wrote books, formed committees, and crusaded to clear his father's name. Where Niklas Frank shouted accusations, Wolf Hess shouted defenses. To his dying breath, he claimed his father was murdered in Spandau prison, a martyr rather than a criminal. And then there was Albert Speer Jr., son of Hitler's chief architect and minister of armaments. Unlike most, he found a way to live outside the shadow. He became an acclaimed architect in his own right, designing skylines from Frankfurt to Shanghai. In interviews, he admitted his childhood memories of Hitler were benign, like an avuncular guest at the table. But as an adult, he confronted the truth. He did not deny, did not excuse, but chose to build, to create, to leave behind something other than ruin. Among the children of the Reich, his was a rare story of survival without surrender. Together, their lives sketch a fractured portrait. Loyalty and denial, guilt and rebellion, silence and confession. They were heirs not to thrones, but to ashes, and in the ashes each chose a different path. Paths that reveal as much about human nature as about the horrors of history. The story of the Nazi children reaches its darkest crescendo in the moments where their past refused to remain silent, where the legacy of their fathers crashed violently into their present lives. It is here, in the tangled space between loyalty, denial, and revolt, that the human cost of inherited guilt reveals itself most brutally. Consider Gudrun Himmler. She was no ordinary child of a war criminal. She became the face of a ghostly resistance. Even as Allied judges condemned her father as the architect of industrialized death, she refused to believe he had taken his own life in custody. She clung to conspiracy, to the comforting lie that he was murdered by enemies too afraid of his truth. As the decades passed, she did more than remember. She acted. From the 1950s onward, Gudrun became deeply involved with Stille Hilfe, an underground network that shielded SS officers from prosecution. She attended veteran reunions, offered legal aid, and raised funds for men who had orchestrated genocide. Photographs show her smiling alongside unrepentant Nazis, a chilling testament that ideology does not always perish with its authors. To the survivors of Auschwitz and Dachau, she was proof that the horror lived on in the hearts of the next generation. If Gudrun's loyalty was a wound kept open, Niklas Frank's rage was a blade plunged deep into it. His public lectures in post-war Germany were thunderclaps against denial. He called his father, Hans Frank, a murderer, a tyrant, a man unworthy of a grave. Niklas did not whisper his contempt. He shouted it so loudly that German audiences sat in stunned silence. In one interview, he confessed that he visited his father's execution site at Nuremberg, not to mourn, but to ensure justice had been done. His books, such as In the Shadow of the Reich, were not memoirs but indictments. He transformed his life into a living accusation, forcing his countrymen to confront what so many wish to forget. If Gudrun represented the persistence of the past, Niklas embodied their relentless demand to face it. Rolf Mengele's climax came in a jungle half a world away. In 1977, he flew to Brazil, where whispers claimed his father, Josef Mengele, the angel of death, lived under an alias. The reunion was surreal. Rolf, a lawyer raised in the rubble of post-war Germany, now sat across from the man who had selected children for gas chambers with a flick of his hand. He hoped, perhaps, for remorse. Instead, he was met with pride. Josef Mengele boasted of his experiments, describing twisted surgeries as though they were scientific achievements. For Rolf, it was a revelation too grotesque to bear. He cut ties immediately, sickened by the realization that his father felt no guilt. Yet he chose silence. He did not alert authorities, did not expose his father's hiding place. When Josef Mengele drowned in 1979, it was as a free man. And in that silence, Rolf carried a burden heavier than confession, complicity by omission. His choice haunted him for the rest of his life, a reminder that sometimes the loudest scream is the one swallowed. Wolf Hess, too, lived in confrontation, not with his father's guilt, but with the world's judgment. Rudolf Hess had flown solo to Scotland in 1941, hoping to strike a peace deal, only to be imprisoned for life. To Wolf, this was not the folly of a deluded fanatic, but the noble act of a patriot. He devoted his entire existence to clearing his father's name, rallying supporters, and publishing books that painted Rudolf Hess as a misunderstood hero. His defiance was unyielding. Even after his father's apparent suicide in Spandau prison in 1987, Wolf claimed murder. At rallies, he shouted into microphones that history had lied, that his father was betrayed. His obsession consumed him, making his own life a stage for the same drama of denial that had defined the Reich. These stories converge into a chilling pattern. The children of monsters forced to decide whether to embrace, reject, or redefine their inheritance. Gudrun Himmler chose loyalty so absolute it bordered on fanaticism. Niklas Frank transformed hatred of his father into a mission of remembrance. Rolf Mengele fled from his father's shadow, but could never escape the silence he kept. Wolf Hess fought history itself, brandishing denial as a weapon. Each climax was not just personal, but generational, a replay of the war on a quieter, more intimate battlefield. Their lives remind us that evil does not vanish when its perpetrators fall. It echoes, reverberates, takes new shapes in the children left behind. And in those children, the world caught a glimpse of the most terrifying truth, that the past is never truly past. The downfall of the Nazi children was not marked by trials in grand courtrooms or the thunder of armies, but by the quiet erosion of their lives under the weight of names that never died. Where their fathers had faced ropes and tribunals, the sons and daughters bore invisible chains, destinies that twisted into silence, exile, or bitter defense. Etta Goering's collapse was subtle, almost ghost-like. As a child, she had been paraded as the golden daughter of Reichsmarshal Hermann Goering, a symbol of Nazi grandeur. She wore fine dresses, lived in marble halls, and received priceless paintings as gifts. But after her father bit into a cyanide capsule at Nuremberg, her world shattered. Stripped of privilege, she withdrew from public life, living modestly in Munich. Yet the downfall was not merely material. In interviews, she clung to the fantasy of her father as a loving man, denying the monstrous role he played. Her refusal to reconcile love with truth condemned her to a life of denial, never free, never honest, only haunted. Martin Bormann Jr., once a missionary of faith, faced his reckoning in old age. Allegations of abuse from his years in the Catholic Church surfaced, dragging him into scandal. He had tried to redeem the name Bormann through service, through faith, through good works in foreign lands, but the shadow reclaimed him, and the accusations ensured that his attempt at salvation collapsed under the weight of human frailty. His downfall was not as spectacular as his father's flight into the Alps, but it was devastating nonetheless. A man who could not fully escape sin, whether inherited or his own. For Rolf Mengele, the true downfall came with his silence. After meeting his father in South America, he chose to conceal Josef Mengele's whereabouts. He returned to Germany carrying knowledge that could have delivered one of history's most wanted men to justice. By protecting that secret, he chained himself to complicity. The world never forgave the silence, and Rolf never forgave himself. His downfall was the gnawing truth that he had held history in his hands and let it slip away. Wolf Hess descended into obsession. His life became a single crusade to prove that his father, Rudolf Hess, was innocent, even martyred. Instead of building a life of his own, he shackled himself to conspiracy theories and rallies. He shouted louder as the decades passed, but history did not bend. When Rudolf Hess was found dead in his cell at Spandau in 1987, the son's protests turned shrill, his defenses desperate. His downfall was a life consumed by a ghost he could never vindicate. Even Albert Speer Jr., who achieved worldly success as an architect, could not wholly escape. In interviews, he admitted to memories of Hitler as a kindly uncle in his childhood home, only to later reckon with the vast crimes that man enabled. Though he built skyscrapers in cities, his name forever carried the shadow of the Reich's master planner. His downfall was the reminder that no matter how high he built, the foundation was always ashes. The children of the Reich did not fall in fire or fury. They fell in quieter, crueler ways, in denial, in scandal, in silence, in obsession, in the inescapable shadow of memory. Their downfalls were less visible than their fathers, but in some ways more enduring, because they lived long, ordinary lives that could never be ordinary at all. In the aftermath of war, the children of the Reich became living echoes of crimes they did not commit, yet could never escape. While the Nuremberg trials closed with the clang of gallows and the pronouncements of justice, their lives stretched on in uneasy silence. The fathers were condemned, but what of the sons and daughters left behind? For decades, journalists and historians pursued them. Some refused interviews, hiding behind locked doors and false names. Others stepped reluctantly into the light, speaking of their fathers with bitterness, loyalty, or shame. Each word was measured against the weight of history, each silence interpreted as complicity. In the public imagination, they were symbols more than people. Reminders that evil was not a phantom of the past, but a shadow that lingered in families and bloodlines. Post-war German society struggled with them as well. Schools, workplaces, and neighbors often judged them by their surnames. A child could not walk into a classroom without whispers trailing behind. That is Himmler's daughter. That is Göring's child. The sins of the fathers clung like smoke, impossible to wash away. Some of these children found themselves frozen out of opportunity, while others fled abroad, hoping distance could break the chain. It never truly did. Yet their existence also served as a mirror for a nation. Through them, Germany was forced to confront not only the crimes of leaders, but the lingering power of ideology and denial. The aftermath was not a single moment in 1945. It was decades of reckoning, silence, and confrontation that stretched well into the 21st century. In every interview, every confession, every denial, the children of the Reich carried forward the haunting truth that history does not end with verdicts. It lives on quietly in those who must bear its name. They lived, but never freely. The children of the Reich grew old beneath names that carried more weight than any monument or memorial. Their lives became a final chapter to the story their fathers began. A warning carved not in stone, but in flesh and blood. Each choice they made, whether to defend, to deny, to condemn, or to disappear, was a reminder that the past is never a closed book. It breathes, it lingers, it shapes the future through those left to inherit its shadows. Gudrun Himmler's unyielding loyalty, Niklas Frank's fierce denunciations, Rolf Mengele's silence, Wolf Hesse's obsession, Etta Göring's retreat, Martin Bormann Jr.'s flawed pursuit of redemption, Albert Speer Jr.'s struggle to build anew. All of them are pieces of a puzzle that reveals how history never ends with the death of its perpetrators. Instead, it seeps into the marrow of those who remain, binding their lives to a legacy they did not choose. And so the lesson is not just theirs, but ours. Evil is not buried with its architects. It passes on. In silence, in denial, in loyalty, in shame. To study the children of the Reich is to glimpse the endurance of history's darkest truths. They remind us that the aftermath of atrocity is measured not only in ruins and graves, but in the way shadows stretch across generations. Because there are ghosts that do not haunt battlefields or bunkers. They haunt bloodlines, they haunt memories. And as long as their names are spoken, the war is never truly over.